A tornado tore through Meredith Cooper's life, destroying not just her inherited farmhouse but everything she thought she knew about her family's past. The debris revealed a hidden bunker entrance, untouched since the Cold War, containing documents that would solve a decades-old mystery that had divided her rural community for generations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Meredith Cooper stared at the devastation before her, rain still dripping from her ponytail as the storm clouds retreated across the horizon. Where her childhood home had stood just hours ago, there was nothing but splintered wood, shattered glass, and the exposed concrete foundation. The tornado had come without warning, a monstrous F4 that had cut a half-mile swath through the rural community of Riverdale, with her family's century-old farmhouse directly in its path. At 35, Meredith was back where she had sworn never to return, a single mother with 2 children asleep in the back of her weathered Honda Civic parked safely down the road. The house, her late father's final gift to her, left in his will just 3 months ago, was supposed to be their fresh start after her divorce. Now it was gone, scattered across 50 acres of rolling farmland that had been in the Cooper family for generations. "My God, Meredith." Sheriff Dan Holbrook approached from his patrol car, his weathered face grim as he surveyed the wreckage. Dan had known Meredith since she was a little girl running barefoot through these very fields. Now he looked at her with the same expression he'd worn at her father's funeral, a mixture of sympathy and something else she couldn't quite name. "You shouldn't be out here alone. The storm might have weakened the ground. It's not safe." "I had to see it," Meredith said, her voice hollow as she pushed a strand of wet hair from her face. "I needed to know if anything survived." Dan placed a hand on her shoulder. "Power lines are down all over the county. Rescue crews are still clearing the roads. You should come back to town, stay at the motel until morning." Meredith shook her head. "My kids are in the car. They've been through enough already. We'll stay with Aunt Jenny tonight." She turned back to the ruins of the house. "I just need a few minutes here." "Alone?" Dan hesitated, then nodded. "I'll check on the Millers down the road. Their place got hit too. Don't stay too long." He squeezed her shoulder before heading back to his cruiser. As the sheriff's taillights disappeared down the muddy road, Meredith picked her way carefully through the debris field. The tornado had been mercurial in its destruction. Her father's ancient oak desk lay virtually untouched on the bare foundation, while the walls that had surrounded it were simply gone. Family photos, kitchen appliances, and her children's freshly unpacked toys were strewn across the property as if discarded by a petulant giant. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The rain started again, gentle now, as Meredith salvaged what she could. A photo album, miraculously intact. Her daughter Emma's favorite teddy bear, muddied but salvageable. Her son Tyler's baseball glove. Small treasures amid catastrophic loss. As she moved toward where the back porch had stood, something caught her eye, a dark rectangular opening in the ground that had been hidden beneath the house for as long as she could remember. The storm had torn away the porch and several feet of soil beneath it, exposing what appeared to be a concrete entrance to some kind of underground structure. Meredith frowned, approaching cautiously. In all her years growing up in this house, she had never known of any cellar or bunker. Her father, Thomas Cooper, a taciturn man of few words even before her mother's death 15 years ago, had certainly never mentioned it. Using her phone's flashlight, Meredith examined the opening. Concrete steps descended into darkness, partially blocked by soil and debris. A heavy metal door hung partially open on rusted hinges, its surface marked with what appeared to be faded yellow and black civil defense symbols, remnants of the Cold War era. "What the hell, Dad?" she whispered, her breath catching as she cleared away enough debris to see that the bunker entrance was intact enough to enter. Her practical side told her to leave, to come back in daylight with proper equipment and perhaps the sheriff. But curiosity, and a lifetime of unanswered questions about her quiet, secretive father, pulled her forward. Switching her phone to video mode, Meredith carefully descended the exposed concrete steps. The metal door groaned as she pushed it further open, revealing a passage that extended beneath what had once been her family's home. The air that rushed out was stale but dry, carrying the scent of old paper and metal. The bunker was surprisingly large, roughly the size of a two-car garage, with reinforced concrete walls and a ceiling supported by steel beams. Battery-powered emergency lights still functioned dimly along the walls, casting everything in a pale, yellowish glow that flickered occasionally like dying fireflies. Metal shelving lined the walls, stocked with supplies that hadn't been touched in decades, canned food with faded labels, water containers, first aid kits, and battery-powered radios. A military-style cot stood in one corner beside a small desk and chair. But it was what covered the desk that made Meredith gasp: dozens of files, maps, and photographs, meticulously organized and preserved in plastic sheeting. She approached slowly, her heartbeat quickening. The top folder was labeled Project Nightshade in her father's unmistakable block handwriting. Beneath it was a black and white photograph of 5 men standing in front of what appeared to be this very bunker, its entrance new and unmarked by decades of weathering. Her father, much younger but recognizable, stood at the center of the group, his expression serious. On the back, written in faded ink, Nightshade Team, 1962. "Dad, what were you involved in?" Meredith murmured, carefully opening the folder. The documents inside told a story that seemed impossible: reports of agricultural experiments conducted on the Cooper farm and 4 neighboring properties between 1962 and 1968. The language was technical, filled with scientific terminology about crop resilience, genetic modifications, and something called Compound N7. Interspersed were security clearance forms bearing her father's signature and the seal of the United States Department of Agriculture, but with references to military applications that seemed far removed from ordinary farming. As Meredith continued reading, the bunker's emergency lights flickered again, plunging her momentarily into darkness before resuming their weak illumination. It was enough to remind her of her precarious situation, alone in an underground structure of unknown stability after a major tornado. Gathering as many of the files as she could fit into her jacket, Meredith reluctantly headed back toward the stairs. The rain had intensified when she emerged, the night sky occasionally illuminated by distant lightning. As she picked her way back through the debris toward her car, headlights approached from the main road, not the sheriff's cruiser, but a mud-spattered pickup truck that Meredith recognized immediately. Henry Miller, her father's oldest friend and neighbor, pulled to a stop beside her Honda. Henry was in his 70s now, but still moved with the purposeful energy of a man decades younger as he climbed out of his truck. His face, weathered from a lifetime working under the Midwestern sun, betrayed nothing as his eyes moved from Meredith to the exposed bunker entrance and back. "Saw the sheriff heading to my place, came to check on you instead," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Looks like Thomas's secret's finally out." Meredith clutched the files tighter beneath her jacket. "You knew about this? All these years?" Henry's gaze dropped to the papers she was poorly concealing. "What did you find down there, Mary?" The childhood nickname caught her off guard, momentarily transporting her back to summers spent climbing apple trees on the Miller farm while her father and Henry spoke in hushed tones on the porch. How many of those conversations, she now wondered, had been about whatever Project Nightshade entailed? "I found enough to know my father wasn't just a farmer," she said, studying Henry's face for a reaction. "These papers mention you too, Henry. Your farm, your signature on some of the same documents." The old man sighed, leaning against his truck. "It was a different time, Meredith. The height of the Cold War. When the government men came asking for our help, talking about national security and the Soviet threat, we believed them." He looked toward the exposed bunker. "We all did. Your father, me, Bill Harwood, the Peterson brothers, all 5 of us." "The men in the photograph," Meredith said, the pieces starting to align. Henry nodded. Thomas was the leader. Had the scientific background from his time at the university before he took over his daddy's farm. The rest of us contributed our land, our labor, our silence. Silence about what? These papers mention crop experiments, but there are references to military applications, security clearances. Meredith's voice trailed off as she saw something shift in Henry's expression. "We should get you and the kids to Jenny's," he said abruptly, glancing at the darkening sky. "More storms possible tonight. We can talk about the past tomorrow." Meredith stood her ground. "My entire life, I watched my father carry something heavy. Something that put those lines in his face and kept him up at night. After Mom died, it only got worse. He would stare out at these fields like they were filled with ghosts." She took a step closer to Henry. "I deserve to know what happened here." A flash of lightning illuminated the conflict on the old farmer's face. "Thomas made us all promise, Meredith. When the project ended, when we realized what they were really after, we swore never to speak of it again. Not to our wives, not to our children. It was better that way. Safer." "Safer for who?" Meredith pressed. Before Henry could answer, a second set of headlights appeared on the road, slowing as they approached the farm. The sleek black SUV that pulled up behind Henry's truck was unfamiliar to Meredith, its government plates visible even in the dim light. A man in his 50s emerged, wearing a rain-spattered suit that looked out of place amid the rural destruction. His movements were precise as he surveyed the scene, his gaze lingering on the exposed bunker entrance before settling on Meredith and the papers she held. "Ms. Cooper," he called, approaching with an outstretched hand. "I'm Director Richard Larson, Department of Agriculture, Special Historical Division. We've been monitoring the storm damage in the area." His smile didn't reach his eyes as they flickered to the documents partly visible beneath her jacket. "I see you've made quite a discovery." Henry stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between Meredith and the newcomer. "Bit late for the USDA to be making house calls, isn't it, Director? Especially after a tornado." Larson's smile remained fixed. "When historical USDA sites are potentially compromised, we respond quickly, Mr. Miller. Protocol hasn't changed since your involvement." The casual mention of Henry's involvement confirmed Meredith's suspicions that this was no ordinary agricultural official. She tightened her grip on the files, suddenly reluctant to let this stranger see what she had found. "I was just telling Meredith that she and her children should get to town," Henry said, his voice carrying a warning that Meredith had never heard from the gentle farmer before. "The structural integrity of this whole area is questionable after the storm." "Of course," Larson nodded, though his attention remained fixed on Meredith. "But I'd be remiss in my duties if I didn't secure any government documents that may have been exposed. National Archives protocols and all that." He extended his hand toward Meredith. "If you wouldn't mind, Miss Cooper. Those files are technically federal property." Meredith felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain soaking through her clothes. "These papers were in my father's possession, on my property. I think I'll hold on to them until I understand exactly what my family was involved in." Larson's pleasant demeanor slipped for just a moment, revealing something harder beneath. "Miss Cooper, I don't think you understand the sensitivity." "She understands just fine," Henry interrupted. "And she's right. Thomas Cooper kept those records for a reason, even though the rest of us wanted everything destroyed after '68. He turned to Meredith. "Your father was the only one who believed the truth would eventually come out, that it needed to. The rest of us were too scared." "Scared of what?" Meredith asked, looking between Henry and the increasingly impatient government man. Henry's weathered face was grim in the beam of the truck's headlights. "Of what they made us do here. Of what grew in these fields." He nodded toward the ruins of the house and the exposed bunker. "And what's buried beneath them." Director Larson stepped forward, his professional veneer cracking. "Mr. Miller, you signed non-disclosure agreements that remain in effect to this day. National security implications." "National security?" Henry scoffed. "Is that what we're still calling it? After all these years?" He turned to Meredith, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and resolve. "Your father kept records of everything, the real experiments, not the cover story they fed Washington. He believed someone needed to know the truth if anything ever happened. And something did happen, didn't it?" Meredith said quietly, the pieces falling into place. In 1968. That's when the project ended. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, illuminating the tension between the three figures standing amid the tornado's destruction. In that brief, electric moment, Meredith saw the truth reflected in both men's faces, one haunted by the past, the other desperate to keep it buried. "Get in the truck, Mary," Henry said, not taking his eyes off Larson. "Get your kids and these files to somewhere safe. I'll handle our friend from the government." "This is a mistake," Larson warned, his hand moving toward the inside of his jacket. "What happened here was classified for a reason. Some secrets protect people." "No," Meredith said, suddenly finding her voice. "Secrets protected the people who did this, whatever this was. My father lived with it eating away at him for 50 years. She backed toward her car where her children slept, still clutching the files. "I'm going to find out what happened here, what you made these men do on their own land." Larson's face hardened. "Miss Cooper, I strongly advise." The crack of thunder drowned out his words as another storm cell moved overhead. In that moment of distraction, Henry moved with surprising agility for his age, stepping between Meredith and Larson. "Go," Henry urged. "Jenny will know what to do. She was Thomas's confidant after your mother passed." Meredith hesitated, torn between the need to protect her sleeping children and her reluctance to leave Henry alone with the increasingly agitated government official. "Your father wanted you to know," Henry said, his voice barely audible over the intensifying rain. "That's why he left you the farm, even knowing you didn't want to come back. He was waiting for the right time to tell you everything, but then the cancer moved too fast." His eyes, filled with decades of carried guilt, met hers. "Don't let his last wish die here." With a quick nod, Meredith hurried to her car, the precious files clutched against her chest. As she slipped behind the wheel, she glanced in the rearview mirror at her children, Emma, 7, and Tyler, 10, still mercifully asleep after the trauma of the day. Then her eyes moved to Henry and Director Larson, their confrontation continuing in the rain as lightning illuminated the scene in stark flashes. Starting the engine, Meredith made a decision that would forever alter the course of her life and the history of Riverdale. Instead of turning toward town and the safety of her aunt's home, she put the car in reverse, creating distance between herself and the two men before cutting the headlights and pulling behind the remains of the old barn where she wouldn't be visible from the road. From there, she watched as the conversation between Henry and Larson grew more heated, visible even through the rain-streaked windshield. When Larson pulled what appeared to be a phone from his pocket, Henry knocked it from his hand with surprising force. The government man responded by shoving the elderly farmer back against his truck. Meredith reached for her own phone to call for help, but stopped as headlights appeared on the road, Sheriff Holbrook returning. Relief flooded through her, until she saw what happened next. Instead of intervening in the confrontation, Dan pulled up beside the government SUV and stepped out to speak with Larson. The men exchanged words, both occasionally gesturing toward the exposed bunker entrance. After a moment, Larson retrieved something from his vehicle, what looked like official papers, and handed them to the sheriff. Dan read the documents, nodded, and then approached Henry, speaking with an authority that was visible even from Meredith's hidden vantage point. Whatever he said caused the old farmer's shoulders to slump in defeat. As Meredith watched in growing horror, the sheriff guided Henry into the back of his cruiser while Larson returned to examining the bunker entrance, now using a high-powered flashlight to illuminate its depths. The implications were clear: whatever had happened on her family's land decades ago still carried enough weight that local law enforcement would cooperate with federal authorities without question. Henry's warning about the need to get the files to safety suddenly seemed far more urgent. Checking once more on her sleeping children, Meredith made a decision. She couldn't risk driving past the men on the only access road out of the property. Instead, she would wait for an opportunity to slip away unnoticed, perhaps when they moved their investigation into the bunker itself. As she settled in to wait, Meredith opened one of the files she had rescued. Inside was a handwritten letter, dated 1968, addressed simply, "To my child, when the time comes." Her father's words, written decades before her birth but somehow meant specifically for this moment, stared back at her from the page. "If you're reading this, then the truth has finally surfaced," quite literally from the ground where I buried it. What we did here started with the best of intentions, creating crops that could withstand drought, disease, even radiation in the event of nuclear war. But science without conscience is a dangerous thing. When they pushed us to go further, to create plants that could do more than survive, plants that could be weaponized, most of us agreed. We were patriots, we believed in the cause. Only when we saw the effects on the land, on the wildlife, on ourselves, did we understand the true cost. By then, it was too late. The damage was done. I've spent my life trying to contain what we created, to keep it from spreading beyond the 5 farms where it began. The others wanted to forget, to pretend it never happened. But someone needed to remember, to keep watch, to be ready if what we buried ever found its way back to the surface. That burden now falls to you. I'm sorry. The letter ended there, and signed but unmistakably in her father's handwriting. Meredith's hands trembled as she tucked it back into the file, her mind racing with questions that had no immediate answers. Outside, the rain continued to fall on the ruins of her inherited home, washing away layers of soil that had hidden secrets for half a century. In the back seat, Emma stirred and murmured in her sleep, reminding Meredith of everything at stake. Whatever her father and the other farmers had done in these fields, whatever they had created and then tried to bury, it was now her responsibility. The tornado hadn't just destroyed her home and exposed a forgotten Cold War bunker, it had unearthed a legacy more complex and dangerous than she could have imagined. As Director Larson and Sheriff Holbrook disappeared into the bunker entrance with their flashlights, Meredith Cooper made her decision. Starting the car as quietly as possible, she turned off the main drive and onto the old service road that led through the back fields, a route only someone who had grown up on this land would know existed. The truth about Project Nightshade, about what had been done to her family's land and the surrounding farms, was finally coming to light after decades buried in darkness. And despite the danger, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, Meredith knew one thing with absolute certainty: she would not let her father's final wish die here. The Cooper farm had one last secret to tell. And this time, the world would listen. Meredith's tires slid on the mud-slick service road as rain pounded the windshield. The wipers struggled against the downpour, each flash of lightning briefly illuminating the unfamiliar landscape of her childhood home. Fields that had once grown corn and soybeans now lay barren in the darkness, as if the land itself was holding secrets. She checked her rearview mirror, no headlights followed yet, but it wouldn't take long for Larson and the sheriff to discover she'd fled with the files. Emma stirred in the back seat, her small voice thick with sleep. "Mom? Where are we going?" "To Aunt Jenny's," Meredith answered, forcing steadiness into her voice. "Go back to sleep, sweetie." But as the car crested the hill that separated Cooper land from the neighboring Harwood farm, Meredith hesitated. If the sheriff was involved, Aunt Jenny's would be the first place they'd look. She needed somewhere less obvious, somewhere to catch her breath and process what she'd found. Making a split-second decision, Meredith turned onto the narrow track that led to the old Peterson place. The Peterson brothers, twins who had been part of her father's mysterious Nightshade team, had both died years ago, their property abandoned after a bank foreclosure. If her memory served, the farmhouse still stood, unused but structurally sound. The headlights cut through sheets of rain as she pulled behind what remained of the Peterson barn, positioning her car where it wouldn't be visible from the road. The farmhouse loomed ahead, dark and unwelcoming, but dry. "Kids, wake up," she said softly, reaching back to touch Tyler's knee. "We need to make a quick run inside." Tyler rubbed his eyes, immediately alert in the way children of divorce often are, accustomed to midnight moves and sudden changes of plan. "Is this Aunt Jenny's?" "No, honey. It's..." Meredith hesitated. "It's a friend's house. Just for tonight." Gathering the files in her phone, Meredith led her sleepy children through the rain to the back door of the Peterson farmhouse. The door was locked, but she remembered the trick her father had taught her years ago. The Petersons always kept a spare key hidden in the loose mortar beside the kitchen window. Inside, the house was musty but intact. Sheets covered the furniture, dust coated every surface, and the air hung heavy with abandonment. But the roof didn't leak, and when Meredith tried a light switch, To her surprise, the electricity still worked. "Why don't you two lie down on that couch while I make a call?" she suggested, arranging her jacket over Emma and Tyler as they curled together on the sheet-covered sofa. Once the children had settled, Meredith retreated to the kitchen and spread the files across the table. Her father's letter haunted her: plants that could be weaponized, damage they couldn't undo, something buried that they feared might resurface. What had happened on these farms? Her phone showed only 1 bar of service, barely enough to make a call. She dialed Aunt Jenny's number, praying her father's sister would answer despite the late hour. "Hello?" Jenny's voice was alert, despite it being nearly midnight. "Aunt Jenny, it's Meredith." "Thank God. The sheriff's been here looking for you. Said there was some kind of problem at Thomas's place after the tornado. Where are you? Are the kids all right?" Meredith hesitated. "We're safe. But something's happening, Jenny. I found a bunker under Dad's house, exposed by the tornado. There were files, records about something called Project Nightshade from the 1960s. The silence on the other end stretched so long that Meredith thought they'd been disconnected. "Jenny? You shouldn't have found that." Jenny's voice had changed, grown tight with what sounded like fear. "Meredith, listen to me carefully. That bunker was never supposed to be opened. Thomas promised me he'd sealed it for good after what happened in '68. What did happen?" Meredith pressed. "These files mention experiments, something that went wrong. Dad left a letter saying they created plants that could be weaponized." Another long silence. Then, "Where are you now?" "I can't tell you. There's a man from the Department of Agriculture, but I don't think that's who he really is. And the sheriff's helping him. They took Henry Miller into custody." Jenny swore under her breath. "They've been watching for years. Waiting for something to happen. We always knew they would come back eventually." "Who's they?" "The ones who started it all. The ones who convinced your father and the others to use their land for experiments no university or government facility would approve." Jenny's voice lowered. "The ones who didn't care what happened to the families who lived here as long as they got their results." Lightning flashed outside the Peterson farmhouse windows, followed by a crack of thunder that made Emma whimper from the living room. "Jenny, I need to understand what my father was involved in. Not over the phone." Jenny's voice was firm. "I'm being watched too, have been ever since Thomas died. They knew he kept records even though he promised to destroy everything." A pause. "There's someone who can help you understand. William Harwood's daughter, Elaine. She still lives on the old Harwood place. Her father told her everything before he died last year." "Bill Harwood's daughter?" Meredith tried to place the name. "I don't remember her. She's about 10 years older than you. Left for college before you were in high school. She came back when Bill got sick." Jenny lowered her voice further. "She's been continuing her father's work, monitoring the affected areas, looking for signs." "Signs of what?" "I've said too much already." The fear in Jenny's voice was unmistakable now. "Go to Elaine. But be careful who sees you. And Meredith, don't trust anyone who wasn't here in '68. Not even the sheriff. Especially not the sheriff." The line went dead. Meredith stared at her phone, her mind racing. She didn't remember much about Bill Harwood except that he'd been the quietest of her father's friends, a thin, scholarly man who rarely spoke at the community gatherings but always watched everything with careful eyes. A sudden bang from outside made her jump. Meredith rushed to the window in time to see a tree branch crash onto the driveway, brought down by the storm. Nothing more sinister than nature's fury. But her nerves were frayed, her trust shattered. Moving quickly, she gathered her still drowsy children and the files. "We need to go to another house," she explained as she bundled them back into the car. "Just for a little while." "Mom, I'm scared," Emma said, clutching her teddy bear. "Everything's going to be fine," Meredith lied, the weight of her father's secrets pressing down on her chest. "We're just having an adventure." The Harwood farm lay 3 miles east, down back roads that Meredith prayed would be passable after the storm. As she drove, headlights off to avoid detection, she tried to make sense of the fragments she'd gathered. 5 farms: Cooper, Miller, Peterson, Harwood, and one other she couldn't identify from the files. All adjacent properties forming a rough circle around what the documents referred to as Ground Zero. All used for experiments that had gone wrong in 1968. The rain slackened as Meredith approached the Harwood property. Unlike the Peterson place, this farm showed signs of active use: crops in the fields, a newer model tractor parked beside the barn, lights glowing warmly from the farmhouse windows despite the late hour. Meredith pulled up to the front gate, hesitating. What if Jenny was wrong? What if Elaine Harwood couldn't be trusted? Before she could decide, the farmhouse door opened, and a woman stepped onto the porch, silhouetted against the light behind her. She stood watching as Meredith's car idled at the gate, then lifted a hand in clear invitation. "Stay here," Meredith told her children, locking the doors before stepping out into the drizzling rain. As she approached the porch, the woman came into focus, tall and angular like her father had been, with streaks of gray in her dark hair despite being only in her mid-40s. She wore practical clothes, jeans, flannel shirt, mud-spattered boots, and her eyes held the wary intelligence of someone who had lived with secrets too long. "Meredith Cooper," she said, not a question but a recognition. "I've been expecting you since I heard about the tornado hitting your father's place." "You're Elaine Harwood?" The woman nodded. "Jenny called. Said you found Thomas's records." Her eyes moved to the car where Tyler and Emma watched wide-eyed through the windows. "You'd better bring the kids inside. It's not safe out here." Something in her tone sent a chill through Meredith that had nothing to do with the rain. "Not safe how?" Instead of answering, Elaine pointed toward the distant Cooper property. "Look." Meredith turned. From this vantage point on higher ground, she could see her father's land spread out below. Emergency vehicles had arrived, more sheriff's department cars, an unmarked van, men moving with purpose around the exposed bunker entrance. The scene was lit by portable floodlights that cast long shadows across the tornado-ravaged property. "They're looking for more than just files," Elaine said quietly. "They're looking for samples." "Samples of what?" Elaine's gaze remained fixed on the distant lights. "Of what grew there. What's still growing there, if my monitoring equipment is right." She finally turned to Meredith. "Get your children inside. Then I'll show you what your father and mine spent their lives trying to contain." The inside of the Harwood farmhouse was a stark contrast to its traditional exterior. What had once been a living room had been converted into a laboratory of sorts. Computers, monitoring equipment, and geological survey maps covered every surface. One entire wall displayed soil sample results, atmospheric readings, and what appeared to be time-lapse photography of various plants. After settling the children with blankets and pillows on the one remaining couch, Meredith followed Elaine to the center of the room where a large, detailed map of all 5 farms was spread across a table. In 1962, Elaine began without preamble. 5 local farmers were approached by a government research division called Agricultural Advancement and Research. They were offered significant financial incentives to participate in what was described as a patriotic scientific endeavor, developing crops that could withstand extreme conditions, including nuclear fallout. She pointed to the center of the map where the 5 properties converged. This area was designated Ground Zero, the primary testing location. Each farm was used to grow different variants of the experimental crops, creating a controlled environment for comparison. "My father's letter mentioned plants that could be weaponized," Meredith said. Elaine nodded grimly. "That came later." By 1965, the original research had yielded promising results: crops that could grow in irradiated soil, withstand extreme temperature fluctuations, resist pests without pesticides. But then the military division funding the project pushed for more. They wanted plants that could do more than survive. They wanted plants that could be used offensively. "Offensively?" Meredith echoed. "How?" Elaine moved to a locked cabinet, retrieving a worn leather journal similar to the one Meredith had found in the bunker. my father kept his own records, against protocol. This contains his observations from 1965 to 1968, when everything went wrong. She opened the journal to a page marked with a faded red tab. They began developing what they called aggressive hybrids, plants with unusual defense mechanisms. Crops that produced natural toxins that could be harvested and weaponized. Plants that spread more rapidly than natural species, choking out native vegetation. The journal contained detailed drawings of plants Meredith had never seen before: corn with abnormally thick stalks, wheat with unusually shaped seed heads, soybeans with strange nodules on their roots. By 1967, they had created something called Compound N7, derived from these hybrid plants. It accelerated growth, strengthened cellular structures, and most importantly from the military's perspective, could be modified to target specific plant species. Elaine's voice grew tight. Imagine the strategic advantage, being able to destroy an enemy's crops while leaving your own untouched. Biological warfare, Meredith whispered. Exactly. But in early 1968, something went wrong. The hybrids began exhibiting unexpected mutations. They grew faster than predicted, spread beyond their designated test plots. And the effects on the surrounding ecosystem were disturbing. Elaine turned to another tabbed page where Bill Harwood had documented abnormalities in local wildlife: deformed fish in the creek that ran through all 5 properties, birds with unusual markings, insects of unprecedented size. The farmers began noticing health effects too. Rashes, respiratory problems, livestock born with defects. Elaine's voice dropped. My mother miscarried twice in 1968. The Petersons' son developed an aggressive form of leukemia. Henry Miller's wife had mysterious neurological symptoms. And my mother? Meredith asked, suddenly connecting dots she'd never seen before. She died of a rare form of cancer when I was 20. Elaine's expression softened with sympathy. Thomas never told you the connection? Your mother grew up on the Jackson farm, the 5th property involved in Project Nightshade. Her family sold the land and moved away in 1969, but by then the damage was done, Meredith finished, a cold realization washing over her. Her parents' relationship, their history, the legacy of illness that had taken her mother, all connected to what had happened in these fields before she was born. In June 1968, there was an incident, Elaine continued, turning to the final marked page in her father's journal. A test plot at Ground Zero produced plants that grew at an exponential rate, breaking all natural limitations. Within 24 hours, they had covered nearly an acre, developing unusual characteristics: luminescence, movement independent of wind, structures that resembled sensory organs. The journal entry included a photograph that made Meredith's skin crawl: twisted, vine-like growths with what appeared to be nodules that resembled eyes spread across a field she recognized as the low-lying area where all 5 farms converged. The research division ordered immediate containment. They brought in military units, burned everything to ash, then excavated the entire area to a depth of 20 feet. The contaminated soil was removed in sealed containers. The farmers were ordered to never speak of what happened, to destroy all records, to forget. But they didn't forget, Meredith said. How could they? The land was poisoned. Their families were suffering. And they suspected, rightly, that not all of the affected soil had been removed. Elaine moved to one of her computer monitors, pulling up what appeared to be thermal imaging of the Ground Zero area. My father began monitoring the site in secret. Your father joined him. Later, Henry Miller too. They were watching for signs that what they had helped create might return. And did it? Meredith asked, dreading the answer. Elaine pointed to the thermal image where unusual heat signatures pulsed beneath the surface. These readings began 3 months ago, around the time your father died. At first, I thought it was anomalous, underground springs, decomposition gases. But the pattern matches exactly what my father documented in 1968, just before the incident. What are you saying? I'm saying that whatever they created, whatever they thought they buried, it's still there. Growing. Changing. Adapting. Elaine's eyes met Meredith's. and the tornado may have given it a path to the surface. The gravity of the situation crashed down on Meredith. This wasn't just about family secrets or government cover-ups. If what Elaine was suggesting was true, something potentially catastrophic was awakening on land that had been in her family for generations, land that now belonged to her. "What do we do?" she asked. Before Elaine could answer, Tyler appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "Mom? There's cars coming." Meredith rushed to the window. Headlights approached along the main road, at least 3 vehicles moving fast toward the Harwood farm. "They've figured out where you went," Elaine said grimly, moving quickly to a desk where she removed a flash drive from one of the computers. "Here, all my research, all my father's observations. Soil samples, growth patterns, thermal imaging. Everything you need to understand what's happening and what's at stake." She pressed the drive into Meredith's hand. "There's another way out of here, the utility road that connects to Route 16. Take it north, then west when you hit the county line." "Come with us," Meredith urged. Elaine shook her head. "I need to stall them, give you time. And someone has to stay to monitor what's happening at Ground Zero." She hesitated, then added, "Find Margaret Wilson in Cedar Rapids." She was the research division's lead scientist until she resigned in protest after the 1968 incident. She's the only one who might know how to stop what's coming. The headlights were getting closer, less than a mile away now. "How will I find her?" "The flash drive is her last known address. Now go, quickly." Meredith gathered her children and the files. As she headed for the door, Elaine caught her arm. "Meredith, there's something else you should know. The reason your father left you the farm despite knowing you didn't want to come back." She hesitated. "The Cooper bloodline has a unique genetic marker, a result of Thomas's early exposure to compound N7 before its effects were understood. It's passed down to his descendants." "What does that mean?" "It means you and your children may be naturally resistant to the effects of what's growing out there. And if the worst happens, you might be the only ones who can get close enough to stop it." The implications of Elaine's words sent a chill through Meredith's core. Before she could respond, the distant vehicles turned onto the long drive leading to the Harwood farm. "Go," Elaine urged, already moving to clear evidence of Meredith's presence. "Find Margaret Wilson. And Meredith, trust the land. It remembers." Minutes later, Meredith and her children were speeding down the utility road Elaine had mentioned, the car's headlights cutting through darkness as rain began to fall again. In the rearview mirror, flashing lights illuminated the Harwood farmhouse as vehicles surrounded it. "Mom, what's happening?" Tyler asked, his young voice steady despite the fear evident in his eyes. "Why are we running from the police?" Meredith gripped the steering wheel, her father's files and Elaine's flash drive secure in her bag beside her. How could she explain to her children that their grandfather had unwittingly helped create something that now threatened not just their family but potentially much more? That the land they had just inherited carried both danger and strange protection in its soil? "Sometimes," she said carefully, "people hide the truth because they're scared or ashamed. Your grandfather discovered something important, something dangerous, and he tried to protect everyone by keeping it secret. Now it's our job to finish what he started." "Are we in trouble?" Emma asked in a small voice. "No, sweetie," Meredith lied, accelerating as they reached Route 16. "We're just going to find someone who can help us understand Grandpa's work." As they drove north toward Cedar Rapids, away from the only home Meredith had ever known, the storm clouds finally broke. Moonlight spilled across the landscape, illuminating fields that stretched to the horizon, fields that now seemed less like the benign backdrop of her childhood and more like living entities with secrets growing beneath their surface. Meredith thought of Henry Miller in police custody, of Elaine Harwood facing government agents alone, of her father who had carried this burden silently for decades. 5 farms, 5 families bound by choices made before she was born. And now the consequences of those choices had fallen to her. The flash drive in her bag contained answers, scientific data, historical records, perhaps even a solution to whatever was awakening at Ground Zero. But as Meredith Cooper drove through the night with her children, fleeing from the very authorities that should have protected them, she understood that some truths couldn't be contained in files or formulas. The land remembered. It always had. And now it was ready to reveal its long-buried secrets, whether humanity was prepared or not. Behind them, a faint luminescence began to spread across the distant fields where the tornado had torn away decades of careful concealment, a soft, unearthly glow that pulsed like a heartbeat beneath the moonlit soil of 5 farms bound by a shared legacy of hope, ambition, and devastating regret. The sunrise painted the highway in shades of gold and amber as Meredith drove through the quiet streets of Cedar Rapids, her children finally sleeping in the back seat after the long night's journey. The address on Elaine's flash drive led to a modest bungalow on the outskirts of town, its garden meticulously maintained despite the early spring chill. Meredith parked across the street, studying the house for signs of life. Margaret Wilson would be in her 80s now, if she was still alive, if this address was current, if she was willing to revisit a past she had walked away from 50 years ago. So many ifs standing between Meredith and the answers she desperately needed. "Mom?" Tyler's voice came from the back seat, thick with sleep. "Where are we?" "Hopefully somewhere safe," Meredith answered, turning to look at her son. His features, so like her father's, were creased with confusion and worry beyond his 10 years. "I need to talk to someone who used to work with Grandpa. Why don't you and Emma wait here while I check if she's home?" Tyler's face clouded. "What if the bad men come while you're gone?" The simple question pierced Meredith's heart. In less than 24 hours, her children's world had been upended, not just by the tornado that had destroyed their new home, but by the realization that adults they should trust were now threats to avoid. "They won't find us here," she said with more confidence than she felt. "But if you see any cars you don't recognize, honk the horn 3 times. I'll come running." The walkway to Margaret Wilson's front door seemed impossibly long, each step weighted with the responsibility Meredith carried, for her children, for the land that had been in her family for generations, for whatever was growing beneath that soil even now. Her knock was answered almost immediately by a woman whose appearance defied her advanced age. Margaret Wilson stood straight-backed and alert, her silver hair cropped short in a practical style, her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore gardening clothes and carried pruning shears, as if Meredith had interrupted her morning routine. "You're Thomas Cooper's daughter," she said without preamble, her gaze taking in Meredith's exhausted state, the car with children waiting across the street. "I've been expecting someone from Riverdale since the storm system moved through. I just didn't know which side would reach me first." Meredith blinked in surprise. "You knew my father?" "I knew all 5 of them. Brilliant farmers with a dangerous amount of trust in government promises." Margaret stepped back from the doorway. "You'd better come inside. Bring your children. There are people looking for you who won't hesitate to use them as leverage." 10 minutes later, they sat around Margaret's kitchen table, the children occupied with toast and orange juice while the 2 women spoke in low tones. "I need to understand what's happening," Meredith said, placing her father's files and Elaine's flash drive on the table. "The tornado exposed a bunker on our farm. There are government agents searching the property. Elaine Harwood says something dangerous is growing at what they called Ground Zero." Margaret's expression remained neutral as she examined the materials Meredith had brought, but her fingers trembled slightly, the only indication of her inner turmoil. Project Nightshade was meant to be agricultural research with defensive applications, she began, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "Creating crops that could withstand extreme conditions, drought, blight, even radiation. Insurance against Soviet attacks on our food supply. That was the story we told ourselves, anyway." She opened one of Thomas Cooper's files, nodding as she recognized his handwriting. "I was the lead botanist, specializing in genetic adaptation. We chose those 5 farms because they formed a perfect microclimate, isolated enough for security, diverse enough in soil composition for comprehensive testing." She looked up at Meredith. "Your father was essential to the project. He had both the scientific background and the generational knowledge of the land." "But something went wrong," Meredith prompted. Margaret's mouth tightened. "Science without ethical boundaries always goes wrong. By 1967, We'd created plant hybrids that exceeded our wildest expectations, crops that could grow in irradiated soil, withstand temperature extremes, resist any pest or disease. But the military overseers wanted more. They pushed us to develop what they called aggressive cultivation, plants that could be weaponized. Compound N7, Meredith said, remembering Elaine's explanation. Yes. A growth accelerant derived from our hybrids. Initially developed to help crops flourish in hostile environments, but the military saw different applications: the ability to choke out enemy agriculture, to create impenetrable organic barriers, to deploy toxins through plant vectors. Margaret rose from the table, moving to a locked cabinet in her living room. She returned with a worn leather case, from which she removed a sealed glass vial containing what appeared to be ordinary soil. "This is what we created," she said, placing the vial carefully on the table. Soil from Ground Zero, preserved exactly as it was after the incident in 1968. "Look closely." Meredith leaned forward. At first glance, it appeared to be normal dark earth. But as she watched, tiny movements disturbed the surface, not insects or worms, but the soil itself, shifting in rhythmic patterns like a heartbeat. The hybrid plants we developed began exchanging genetic material with native soil bacteria, Margaret explained. The result was something entirely new, a unified organism that exists at both microscopic and macroscopic levels. Soil that behaves with collective intelligence, that adapts to threats, that grows plants as extensions of itself rather than as separate entities. Meredith stared at the vial, repulsed and fascinated. "Is it dangerous?" "That depends on your definition of danger." Margaret carefully returned the vial to its case. "What we created isn't malevolent, it simply exists beyond our understanding of biological boundaries. The problem came when we tried to control it, to weaponize it. It adapted to our interventions, developed defensive mechanisms. By June 1968, it had begun producing plants with unprecedented characteristics: bioluminescence, independent movement, structures that resembled sensory organs. And the government tried to destroy it," Meredith said, thinking of the burned fields mentioned in her father's notes. "They tried. They burned everything, excavated the contaminated soil, sealed it in containment vessels supposedly bound for a secure facility." Margaret's expression hardened. "But your father and the others suspected what I knew for certain: they couldn't possibly have removed it all. The organism had already spread beyond the surface, establishing networks deeper than any equipment could reach. So they formed their own containment plan," Meredith said, understanding dawning. "The 5 of them, monitoring the land, watching for signs of resurgence." Margaret nodded. "They became the guardians of their own creation, in a way. Each monitoring their portion of what had been Ground Zero, passing the responsibility down when they could." Her eyes met Meredith's. "Your father was the last of the original 5. When he died, the balance was broken." Outside, the morning light strengthened, illuminating Margaret's garden where plants grew with unusual vigor despite the season, evidence of the botanist's continued work with more conventional methods. "Elaine said I might be resistant," Meredith said quietly, glancing at her children who were now exploring a bookshelf filled with botanical texts. "Something about a genetic marker from my father's early exposure." "More than resistant," Margaret corrected. "Recognized. The organism identifies genetic signatures it's encountered before. The Cooper bloodline carries markers from Thomas's exposure during development. To the organism, you're not a threat, you're familiar." The implication sent a shiver through Meredith. "And my children?" "The same. Diluted, but present." Margaret hesitated. "Which is why we have a chance to contain this situation before it escalates further." "How?" "The organism responds to familiar genetic signatures. It can be guided, communicated with on a cellular level, by those it recognizes." Margaret leaned forward. "Your father knew this. It's why he monitored the site personally all these years, using his presence to keep the growth pattern stable. It's why he left you the farm despite knowing you wanted no part of rural life. He knew someday you might need to do what he did, to stand at Ground Zero and use your inherited connection to communicate with what lies beneath." Meredith shook her head in disbelief. You're talking about it like it's sentient. Not sentient as we understand consciousness, no. But aware in its own way. Responsive. Adaptive. Margaret studied Meredith's face. And currently responding to the disturbance caused by the tornado and the intrusion of strangers on the land. The government agents, Meredith realized. They're making it worse by being there. Precisely. Their presence, unfamiliar, potentially threatening, will trigger defensive growth. And if they attempt containment measures like those used in '68, the response could be. Margaret's voice trailed off. Catastrophic, Meredith finished. We need to return to Riverdale, Margaret said, rising from the table with unexpected energy for her age. You need to be there, at ground zero, before they provoke a response they can't control. Meredith glanced at her children, conflicted. I can't take them back into danger. Margaret considered this, then nodded. I have a colleague here in Cedar Rapids, another former researcher who left the project when I did. He can watch over them while we're gone. And how do we get past the agents guarding my father's land? A smile ghosted across Margaret's face. Those men are looking for Thomas Cooper's records, for scientific explanations and evidence of what happened 50 years ago. She gestured to the files and flash drive on the table. But the real answer isn't in any document. It's in the land itself, and in the bloodline that's connected to it. There are ways onto your property that only someone who truly belongs there would know. 3 hours later, Meredith found herself crouched in the bed of Henry Miller's old pickup truck, hidden beneath a tarp as Margaret drove them along forgotten back roads toward Riverdale. Margaret's colleague, a retired botanist named Dr. Reeves, had agreed to look after Tyler and Emma, promising to keep them hidden until Meredith returned. The journey gave Meredith time to process everything she'd learned, about her father, about the experiment that had changed 5 families forever, about the strange legacy flowing in her veins. She thought of her mother, whose early death now made tragic sense. She thought of her father, silently carrying the burden of what he'd helped create, watching over the land long after the others had died or moved away. How did you stay away? Meredith asked as they approached the county line, the familiar landscape of her childhood coming into view. Knowing what was left behind, how did you build a new life? Margaret was quiet for a moment. I didn't, not really. Every plant I've cultivated since 1968 has been an attempt to understand what we created here. Every research paper I've published has been carefully worded to share what I learned without revealing its source. She sighed. We never truly leave our mistakes behind, Meredith. We just find ways to live with them. The truck slowed as they reached the outskirts of Riverdale. From their elevated position on the ridge road, they could see activity around the Cooper farm, vehicles with government markings, men in hazmat suits entering and exiting the exposed bunker, equipment being unloaded from trucks. They're preparing for extraction, Margaret observed grimly. They think they can remove it like they tried before. How do we get past them? Meredith asked. We don't need to reach the house or the bunker. We need to reach ground zero, the convergence point of all 5 farms. Margaret turned onto a logging trail that Meredith had forgotten existed, a narrow track that wound through the densely wooded area separating the Miller and Harwood properties. There's an access point through the old fire break. Your father showed it to me decades ago. The truck bounced and rattled along the overgrown path until Margaret finally stopped in a small clearing. This is as far as we go by vehicle. From here, we walk. As they made their way through the woods, Meredith noticed subtle changes in the vegetation, plants growing with unusual density, wildflowers blooming out of season, vines that seemed to shift slightly as they passed. The air felt different too, charged with an energy she couldn't name but somehow recognized. It's responding to our presence, Margaret whispered, noticing Meredith's observation. To your presence, specifically. It remembers the Cooper bloodline. They emerged from the tree line into what had once been a low-lying meadow where the boundaries of all 5 farms converged. What Meredith saw there stopped her in her tracks. The meadow had transformed. Plants of impossible varieties grew in concentric circles around the central point, their forms unlike anything in nature, translucent leaves that caught the sunlight like prisms, flowers that turned to track their movement, vines that formed complex, almost architectural structures. And everything pulsed with a faint luminescence that seemed to flow beneath the soil, connecting each growth to the others. Ground Zero, Margaret breathed, her scientific detachment momentarily broken by wonder. It's beautiful. Meredith felt no fear as she approached the edge of the transformed meadow. Instead, she experienced an inexplicable sense of recognition, as if the land itself acknowledged her return. "What do I do?" she asked. "Walk to the center," Margaret instructed. "Let it sense you fully. Then focus your thoughts on containment, on balance. The organism responds to intention as much as to physical stimuli." Taking a deep breath, Meredith stepped into the meadow. The plants seemed to part before her, creating a path that led to the center of the concentric growth patterns. The luminescence beneath the soil brightened where she walked, following her progress like ripples in water. At the center, Meredith knelt and placed her hands directly on the earth. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming, a rush of impressions too rapid to process consciously. Images flickered through her mind, her father as a young man standing in this very spot, the 5 farmers watching as their land transformed, the military burning fields that refused to die, decades of quiet vigilance as something slumbered beneath the surface, growing, changing, waiting. "It's responding," Margaret called from the edge of the meadow. "The light patterns are stabilizing." Meredith closed her eyes, concentrating on what her father would have wanted: balance, containment, protection. Not destruction, but understanding. Not fear, but respect for what they had created and could never truly unmake. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time seemed fluid in the strange energy field of Ground Zero. When Meredith finally opened her eyes, the wild growth had receded. The plants remained unusual, otherworldly, but no longer pulsed with the intense luminescence that had marked their aggressive expansion. "It recognized you," Margaret said in wonder as Meredith rejoined her. "It responded to your genetic signature just as it did to Thomas's all these years. The balance is restored." Temporarily, Meredith corrected, understanding now what her father had done for decades. "It needs regular contact with the Cooper bloodline to maintain stability. That's why Dad never sold the farm, why he willed it to me despite knowing I wanted to leave Riverdale behind." Margaret nodded solemnly. The legacy he couldn't explain but couldn't escape. "What about the agents at the house? The government's containment plans? They'll find nothing of significance now. The organism has retreated to a dormant state, hidden beneath layers of ordinary soil. As long as you maintain regular contact with Ground Zero, it should remain stable." Meredith looked back at the meadow, transformed yet strangely beautiful in its otherworldliness. "And if I don't? Then what happened in 1968 could repeat itself, but on a larger scale. The organism has had 50 years to establish itself, to adapt, to prepare for threats." Margaret's expression was grave. "Your father understood this responsibility. He accepted it as the consequence of choices made before he fully understood their implications. Now that burden falls to you, or to your children, eventually." The weight of this inheritance settled over Meredith. Her father had left her more than just a farmhouse and fields, he had left her a sacred duty, a connection to something beyond ordinary understanding, a responsibility that transcended personal desire. "We should go before they expand their search perimeter," Margaret urged, gesturing toward the distant Cooper property where activity continued around the bunker. As they made their way back through the woods to the truck, Meredith's mind raced with implications and possibilities. The farm she had inherited, the home destroyed by the tornado, these were just the visible manifestations of a deeper legacy. The true inheritance was this connection to the land, to what lived within it, to the mistakes and wonders of the past. By the time they reached Cedar Rapids and Meredith was reunited with her children, a plan had begun to form in her mind. "What happens now?" Tyler asked as they prepared to leave Dr. Reeves's home, his young face serious with the knowledge that their lives had changed irrevocably. Meredith knelt to meet her son's eyes. "We rebuild, but differently than I planned. We'll stay in Riverdale, on Grandpa's land." "But our house is gone," Emma pointed out, clutching her teddy bear. "We'll build a new one," Meredith said with newfound conviction. "Not where the old one stood, but closer to the meadow at the edge of our property. The place where all 5 farms meet." Margaret, who had been conferring with Dr. Reeves in low tones, approached with a small package wrapped in cloth. "Soil samples from my garden," she explained, handing it to Meredith. "Descendants of the original hybrids, but stabilized through decades of careful cultivation. They'll help you establish a connection with what's growing at ground zero, a bridge between the ordinary and the extraordinary." Meredith accepted the package, understanding its value. "Will you come back with us? Help us understand what we're dealing with?" The older woman shook her head. "My time in Riverdale is done. I left in 1968 because I couldn't face what we had created. But I can give you this." She handed Meredith a thumb drive. "My lifetime of research on the organism, everything I've learned about its properties, its potential benefits when properly understood. Not as a weapon, but as a tool for healing land damaged by human exploitation." As they parted ways, Margaret clasped Meredith's hand. "Thomas would be proud. He always believed that the Cooper bloodline would find a way to transform our greatest mistake into something meaningful." 3 months later, Meredith stood on the porch of the small cabin she and local volunteers had built on Cooper land, watching her children play at the edge of the garden where ordinary vegetables grew alongside Margaret's hybrid specimens. The government agents had long since departed, finding nothing in the bunker beyond decades-old research notes that posed no obvious threat. Henry Miller had been released from custody after the agricultural inspection revealed no violations on his property. He now visited regularly, helping Meredith establish the new Cooper homestead and teaching Tyler the fundamentals of farming that had been passed down through generations. Elaine Harwood had faced questioning but emerged unscathed, her monitoring equipment officially repurposed for agricultural sustainability research funded by a grant Meredith had helped secure through her connections at the university where she now taught part-time. The meadow at Ground Zero remained a carefully guarded secret, accessible only to those who shared the blood connection that kept its otherworldly inhabitants dormant and contained. Each week, Meredith walked its perimeter with her children, their presence reinforcing the boundaries that separated the extraordinary from the ordinary. In time, perhaps, the world might be ready for what grew there, plants with the potential to cleanse polluted soil, to restore ecosystems damaged by industrial farming, to heal land scarred by human misuse. But for now, the legacy of Project Nightshade remained where it belonged, in the careful stewardship of those who understood both its danger and its promise. As the summer sun set over fields that held both tragedy and hope beneath their surface, Meredith thought of her father's words in the letter she'd found that stormy night. Someone needed to remember, to keep watch, to be ready if what we buried ever found its way back to the surface. Thomas Cooper had carried that burden alone after the others had gone. Now his daughter continued what he had begun, not out of obligation but out of a newfound connection to the land that had shaped her family for generations, land that held secrets and wonders in equal measure. The tornado that had destroyed her inherited farmhouse had revealed more than just a Cold War bunker. It had uncovered the truth that had always been there, written in soil and blood. Some legacies cannot be escaped, only embraced and transformed. As Tyler and Emma called her to see a butterfly with unusually iridescent wings that had emerged from the hybrid garden, Meredith smiled. The Cooper farm would never be an ordinary piece of rural America again. But perhaps it had never been ordinary to begin with. The land remembered. And now, so did she. 5 years passed since the tornado exposed the hidden bunker on the Cooper farm. 5 seasons of planting and harvest, of quiet mornings and star-filled nights, of a family learning to live with an extraordinary inheritance that both protected and bound them to the land. The Cooper homestead had taken new shape, not the grand 2-story farmhouse that had stood for generations, but a sprawling single-level home built from locally sourced timber and stone, its foundation purposefully laid near the edge of what the family now privately called the meadow. Windows faced east to catch the sunrise over fields that to casual observers appeared ordinary, though Meredith knew better. On this particular autumn morning, mist clung to the low places as Meredith walked the perimeter of the meadow, her ritual as consistent as the seasons themselves. At 15, Tyler moved confidently beside her, a notebook tucked under his arm where he recorded observations with the methodical precision he'd inherited from a grandfather he'd never known. The luminescence is stronger this week, he noted, kneeling to examine a cluster of plants whose structure defied conventional taxonomy, part flower, part vine, with translucent leaves that captured the early light in prismatic patterns. Do you think it's responding to the drought? Meredith nodded, studying the soil where faint pulses of bluish light traced patterns beneath the surface, visible only to those who knew what to look for. It's adapting, drawing moisture from deeper underground. Margaret's last email mentioned similar patterns in her greenhouse specimens. At 75, Margaret Wilson remained their most important ally, continuing her research from her Cedar Rapids home, documenting the properties of what she now called the unified organism, the interconnected network of plant and soil that existed only at ground zero and in carefully contained samples cultivated under her supervision. "Mom?" Tyler's voice pulled Meredith from her thoughts. "Someone's coming up the drive." Through the morning mist, headlights approached slowly along the gravel road that led to the Cooper property, not the familiar truck belonging to Henry Miller, who at 83 still visited weekly, nor Elaine Harwood's practical SUV. This was a sleek sedan, government issue, its purpose unmistakable. "Go get Emma," Meredith said calmly. "Take her through the woods to Henry's place like we practiced. I'll call when it's safe to return." Tyler hesitated, the man he was becoming visible in the set of his jaw. "I should stay with you." "The meadow needs protection more than I do," Meredith reminded him gently. At 12, Emma had shown the strongest connection to the unified organism, a natural affinity that manifested in her ability to sense its moods, to communicate with it in ways even Meredith couldn't fully understand. "Your sister is our best early warning system. Keep her safe." With reluctant agreement, Tyler jogged toward the house where Emma would be finishing breakfast, preparing for the homeschool lessons that had become their norm since the government's interest in the Cooper property had made traditional education too risky. Meredith squared her shoulders and walked to meet the approaching vehicle, composing her features into the polite mask of rural hospitality that had served her well during previous visits from various agencies, Department of Agriculture, Environmental Protection, Homeland Security, all operating under different pretenses but seeking the same thing: evidence of what had happened here 50 years ago and what might still exist beneath the surface. The car stopped, and a single figure emerged, a woman perhaps 10 years Meredith's senior, dressed in the business attire that marked government officials but carrying herself with an awareness of the farm environment that suggested rural origins. Her dark hair was streaked with silver, her eyes sharp but not unkind as she surveyed the Cooper homestead. "Ms. Cooper," she called, extending her hand as Meredith approached. "I'm Director Catherine Everett, Department of Biological Research." Meredith shook the offered hand, noting the calluses that confirmed her suspicion. This woman had worked land before holding office. "What can I do for the Department of Biological Research today, Director?" "I don't believe we've had the pleasure of hosting your particular agency before." If Catherine Everett caught the subtle challenge in Meredith's tone, she didn't show it. Instead, she smiled slightly. "No, you haven't. We're relatively new, formed specifically to address certain historical research projects that fall outside conventional classifications." "Projects like Nightshade?" Meredith asked directly, tired of the verbal sparring that usually preceded these visits. Surprise flickered across the director's face, quickly masked. "Yes. May we speak privately?" Meredith gestured toward the house. "My children are leaving for a neighbor's. We'll have the place to ourselves in a few minutes." They waited in silence as Tyler and Emma emerged from the house, backpacks slung over their shoulders, moving with the practiced efficiency of children who had grown up understanding the need for quick departures. Emma paused briefly, her gaze moving from her mother to the visitor, then to the distant meadow where the morning mist still lingered. "It's calm," she said simply, a message Meredith understood. The unified organism showed no signs of distress at this new presence on Cooper land. Once the children had disappeared down the path that led through the woods to the Miller property, Meredith led Catherine into the house. The interior reflected the same careful balance as the exterior, modern conveniences alongside traditional farmhouse elements, family photos mixed with botanical sketches, educational materials spread across the dining table where homeschool lessons took place each day. Coffee? Meredith offered, falling into the rhythms of rural hospitality despite her weariness. Please. Catherine settled at the kitchen table, her gaze lingering on a framed photograph of Thomas Cooper standing in his fields, taken perhaps a year before his death. You look like him. The observation, unexpected and personal, caught Meredith off guard. You knew my father? Catherine accepted the mug of coffee with a nod of thanks. Not personally. But I've studied his work, the official agricultural research and the unofficial aspects. My father was military intelligence, assigned to Project Nightshade in its final phase. He was one of the officers who supervised the containment operation in 1968. Meredith tensed. Then you're here to finish what they started? No. Catherine's response was immediate and firm. I'm here because we're finally ready to acknowledge the truth. Project Nightshade was neither a failure to be buried nor a weapon to be exploited. It was something entirely new, something we've spent 50 years pretending doesn't exist instead of understanding. She reached into her briefcase, removing a file stamped with security classifications. 3 months ago, the Department of Biological Research was formed to assess unconventional biological developments that fall outside existing scientific frameworks. Our first priority was a comprehensive review of Project Nightshade. Meredith accepted the file with cautious curiosity. Inside were documents she recognized, copies of her father's research, Margaret Wilson's early reports, military assessments of the 1968 incident. But alongside these familiar materials were new analyses, contemporary scientific interpretations, genetic sequencing of soil samples taken from areas surrounding Riverdale. The government has always known it didn't fully contain what was created here, Catherine continued. Regular satellite monitoring, periodic soil testing, radiation measurements disguised as agricultural surveys, they've been watching for 50 years, waiting for signs of resurgence. And now they've found them, Meredith guessed, thinking of the increased luminescence in the meadow, the accelerated growth patterns that had emerged after the unusually dry summer. Catherine nodded. Satellite imagery shows thermal anomalies consistent with underground biological activity. Soil samples from public land adjacent to the 5 original farms show trace evidence of the unique bacterial structures first documented in 1968. She paused, studying Meredith's face. But the most compelling evidence is the fact that the Cooper property, specifically the area where all 5 farms converge, shows remarkably stable readings despite being at the epicenter of the original incident. And what conclusion has the department drawn from this stability? Meredith asked carefully. That someone is managing the situation. Someone with a genetic connection to the original research. Catherine's gaze was direct. Someone carrying the Cooper bloodline. The moment stretched between them, the truth acknowledged after years of careful concealment. Meredith considered her options, weighing the risk of honesty against the practiced denials that had protected her family for 5 years. Why are you really here, Director Everett? To shut us down? To take samples? To relocate my family to some facility where our genetic connection can be studied? Catherine set her coffee mug down with deliberate care. I'm here to offer a partnership. The world is changing, Ms. Cooper. Climate instability, soil degradation, agricultural collapse in regions that once fed millions. What was created here, this unified organism that responds to human intention, that adapts and evolves beyond conventional biological limitations, could be the key to environmental restoration on a global scale. Or a weapon, Meredith countered, just as the military originally intended. That's why we need you, Catherine said simply. Your family's connection to the organism provides a safeguard that no government containment protocol ever could. You've proven that over 5 years of stable management, something 50 years of military and scientific intervention failed to achieve. She leaned forward, her expression earnest. I'm proposing an official recognition of what your father started and what you've continued, stewardship of a unique biological resource that could help address the most pressing environmental challenges of our time. Meredith laughed softly, the sound holding more wonder than humor. You want to legitimize what we've been hiding. To bring the meadow out of the shadows. Under protected status, Catherine clarified. Limited access. Research conducted under strict ethical guidelines with your family's oversight. The Cooper property designated as a biological preserve with your family as hereditary caretakers. The offer hung in the air between them, simultaneously tempting and terrifying. After years of living with the constant fear of discovery, of training her children for quick escapes, of maintaining elaborate cover stories to explain their isolated lifestyle, the possibility of legitimacy, of acknowledgement, of purpose beyond mere containment was almost overwhelming. I need to consult with others who have been involved in this, Meredith said finally. This isn't just my decision to make. Catherine nodded, understanding. Of course. Margaret Wilson, I assume? And Elaine Harwood? Henry Miller, if his health permits? Meredith's surprise must have shown on her face, for Catherine smiled slightly. As I said, we've been monitoring the situation for decades. We know who's involved. The difference now is that we're ready to work with you rather than against you. 2 weeks later, beneath an October sky so vibrantly blue it seemed painted rather than natural, a remarkable gathering took place at the edge of the meadow. Chairs had been arranged in a semicircle facing the gently undulating field where the unified organism made its home, visible now to the carefully selected visitors as faint patterns of luminescence that pulsed beneath the surface like a heartbeat. Margaret Wilson sat in a place of honor, her 90 years carried with dignity as she surveyed what had grown from research she had abandoned half a century earlier. Beside her, Henry Miller watched with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had lived to see secrets safely brought to light. Elaine Harwood stood slightly apart, her scientist's detachment momentarily overcome by the significance of the moment. For decades, she had carried on her father's work in isolation, feared as an eccentric by neighbors who didn't understand her obsessive monitoring of seemingly ordinary fields. Catherine Everett represented the official delegation, 3 scientists from the Department of Biological Research, each vetted personally by Margaret for their ethical approach to unconventional biology. They stood respectfully back, awaiting permission to approach the meadow that until today had been accessible only to those who shared the Cooper bloodline. Tyler and Emma moved confidently among the visitors, 12 and 15-year-old liaisons between worlds, ordinary childhood and extraordinary inheritance, public education and secret knowledge, human consciousness and something other that communicated through soil and root and cellular recognition. As the group assembled, Meredith stood at the edge of the meadow, feeling the familiar resonance that had become part of her daily existence, the subtle hum of recognition that passed between her blood and the living network beneath her feet. Today, that connection would be extended, carefully and incrementally, to others who might help transform what had begun as a military experiment into something that could heal rather than harm. What we're about to share with you, Meredith began, addressing the assembled group, exists because of choices made by 5 families over 50 years ago, choices made first from patriotism, then from ambition, and finally from responsibility. What began as an attempt to create a biological weapon became instead a legacy of stewardship that has been passed down through generations. She gestured toward the meadow where unusual plants swayed in patterns that didn't quite match the breeze. The unified organism is neither fully plant nor soil bacteria, neither wholly natural nor entirely engineered. It exists at the boundary of our understanding of life itself. And it responds to human intention, particularly the intention carried in the bloodlines of those who helped create it. Margaret Wilson rose shakily to her feet, supported by Tyler's steady arm. What you see here represents both the danger of science without ethical boundaries and the possibility of redemption through careful stewardship. For 50 years, the Cooper family has maintained the balance, containing what could be destructive, nurturing what could be beneficial. Catherine stepped forward, her official capacity momentarily set aside as she addressed the elderly scientist. And now we have the chance to learn from those 5 decades of stewardship. To understand this organism not as a threat to be eliminated or a weapon to be exploited, but as a new form of life with whom we might coexist. The formalities of the partnership were simple, documents signed, agreements made, boundaries established. The Cooper property would become a protected biological research station, with Meredith and her children recognized as essential partners rather than subjects of study. the unified organism would be documented, analyzed, and carefully cultivated under conditions that respected its unique nature and the delicate balance maintained by generations of Coopers. As the visitors were guided in small groups to approach the edge of the meadow, to observe but not yet enter, Meredith found herself standing beside Henry Miller, watching as her children confidently explained the visible characteristics of plants that existed nowhere else on Earth. "Your father would be proud," Henry said quietly, his weathered hand resting on a cane carved from wood that had once been part of the original Cooper farmhouse. He always believed that someday the truth would need to be faced. That what was buried would eventually surface, one way or another. "Do you think he imagined this?" Meredith asked, gesturing toward the scientists who listened attentively as Emma explained how the luminescence patterns changed with the seasons, with the weather, with the presence of different people. That what began in secrecy would end in collaboration. Henry smiled, the expression deepening the lines that decades of worry had etched into his face. Thomas was a man of science, but also of faith, not the church-going kind, but the deeper sort. Faith in the land, in natural balance, in the capacity for healing what had been broken. Even in our darkest days after the incident, when the others wanted to burn everything to ash and salt the earth, Thomas insisted on preservation, on watching and waiting. He turned to face Meredith fully, his eyes clear despite his advanced age. He believed the land remembers, not just what we do to it, but what we learn from it. That wisdom, if we're patient enough to hear it. As evening approached and the visitors departed, Meredith stood alone at the center of the meadow, feeling the familiar resonance beneath her feet, the subtle recognition that passed between her blood and the living network that had become part of her family's legacy. The land remembered, as her father had always said. And now, others would help carry that memory forward, transforming what had begun in fear into something approaching hope. The tornado that had torn through her life 5 years ago, destroying the old farmhouse and exposing the bunker that had held so many secrets, had seemed like an ending. Instead, it had been a beginning, a chance to bring to light what had been buried for too long, to transform containment into stewardship, to expand a circle of responsibility beyond a single family to a community of purpose. As the sun set over fields that held both history and possibility beneath their surface, Meredith thought of all that had been lost and found in the soil of this place, her father's scientific brilliance diverted to military purposes, her mother's life shortened by exposure to what had been created here, her own city life abandoned for a legacy she had never sought but now embraced fully. The Cooper farm would never be an ordinary piece of rural America. But in its extraordinary nature lay the seeds of something that might, with proper care, help heal a world increasingly damaged by human ambition and carelessness. What had begun as Project Nightshade, an attempt to weaponize the natural world, had evolved into something her father might have called Project Renewal, a second chance for science to work with nature rather than against it. Tyler and Emma joined her as darkness fell, the three of them standing together as the meadow began its nightly display, soft bioluminescence rising from the soil, flowing through plant structures in patterns that resembled constellations or perhaps neural networks, a silent communication between what lived below and above the surface. "It's happy," Emma said with the simple certainty of a child who had grown up in conversation with something beyond human understanding. "It likes not having to hide anymore." Meredith put her arms around her children, these carriers of the Cooper bloodline who would someday inherit not just land and house, but responsibility for something unique in all the world. The burden her father had carried alone would be shared now, by family, by scientists like Margaret and Elaine, by officials like Catherine who saw value rather than threat in the unexpected and unprecedented. The land remembered. And finally, after 50 years of secrets and silence, the world was ready to remember with it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.